I'm going to wander about. I'm not got a paper to read. I have to apologise that my talk has sort of suffered from what I would call the abstract drift, in that you're asked to put in your abstract like 12, I don't know, over 12 months ago, and whilst you're still doing the research, and you think you know what you're going to talk about, and you go, oh, yeah, I'm going to tell a simple story, I'll make it as simple as possible. Was there ever such a thing as a Communes movement? And then you carry on doing the research, and you go, oh, it's a bit more complicated than that. And then you have to send your slides in to go on the central computer, and then you go, oh, God, which slides shall I send in? Because you go, I don't quite know what I'm going to talk about now. Yeah, my apologies. This is the introductory slide that I thought up 3 months ago. We are the people our parents warned us against. And I think that's my experience of living communally, really. What I'm going to do is try and answer that question that I put in my abstract and sort of deviate along the way, because it was a much more interesting story than I thought to start with. So the short answer is yes, there was such a thing as the Communes movement, but not as I thought when I started out. I thought I was going to look at a period that started about 1968 and went on to, I don't know, the late 1970s, because that was when I came in the late 1970s. I was attracted by this thing called Communes Network, which had grown out of something I was told was the Communes movement, and it had been really strong and really powerful and produced a lovely magazine, and that was it really. Before the mid-1960s, there wasn't anything. It had just spontaneously arisen in the counterculture in the 1960s. How wrong I was. Move the slide on. I started to look back pre-1960. The book covers the post-war period, starts with the pacifist communities during the war, and then goes into the post-war communities. And I searched and searched and searched to try and find communities that were set up in the 1950s. The one that most people know about is Braziers Park near Oxford. It is still going, which is one of the reasons we still know about it. Could I find anything else from that period? I dug, and it was really difficult to find a sort of communities movement from the 1950s. And then, purely by chance, I was sent, if you want to move it on, a commune in a box. What happened was somebody had heard a radio programme about the new co-housing project at Stroud, Spring Hill, and had phoned the BBC up and said, how do I contact these people? I have the records of a community that I tried to set up that was set up in 1959. And I kept all the documentation for 40 years. And I would like to give it to somebody who might be able to make use of it, might be able to learn from our experience. And so BBC said, yes, here we've got a contact in Stroud. We don't want your box, thank you very much. And they phoned up Stroud, the contact they'd got. So some secretary of a community in Stroud gets this strange request, would you like my box? And she said, well, we don't. What would we do with it? And then she said, well, you might read the things in it. And because I know people at Stroud, somebody said, but Chris Coates, he'll be interested in the contents of the box. So it finally found its way to me, and that's it. It is everything. It is absolutely everything from this community that was behind Madame Tussauds in London, just off Regent's Road, in a tall sort of terraced house behind Madame Tussauds. It's known in my head as the Madame Tussauds community. Stuffed with waxworks of sort of 1950s people. But it's everything. It's everything from the early documentation about getting the house, the advertising for people. It is sort of almost classic, but it's set in 1959. It also has every single note that was ever pinned on their communal notice board. So there's meals rotas, there's a wonderful thing about how people weren't doing their cleaning jobs. Which one of them said, and if this carries on, we will have to recommend that you get a char lady. So it's a nice period piece. It all fell apart after 3 years, and there are all the legal documents of the members suing each other in it, and it is absolutely fascinating. But what was really interesting was there were a number of newsletters in there for an organisation called the Communal Living Association, which was a network of people either trying to set up communal living situations or who had actually done that. And there were a number of groups that I'd never heard of. There seems to be no records of them anymore. One assumes that they lasted a number of years and then faded away. But here was a sort of embryonic communes movement, 1959, 1960s, 1963, goes up to the newsletters, and then it sort of fades away again. And so here was something, and Brazier's community you've just seen was a clear sort of instrumental part in that. They kept coming up again and again. People like the Bruderhof were mentioned, and quite a lot of other groups. We'll move on, Bill. If we then move on to the mid-1960s, this is the classic story that I was told when I came in the 70s into communal living of the communes movement. The story is that there was a group called the Salini community that initially started off as a sort of an embryonic community trying to get growing, eventually bought a small farm in Wales, and they instigated the communes movement. They produced this magazine, and they sort of inspired people to set up and join communes in the late 1960s. Dig a bit deeper and you find, well, they sort of did, but they didn't. They produced this magazine, but pretty much all of it was written by them. And when I say them, I mean the three of them who lived. So, to a certain extent, the beginning of the communes movement is all smoke and mirrors. They produced this beautiful magazine. There are copies, in fact, go on. They produced this beautifully printed offset print magazine that looks like it's fantastic. It's a movement. It must be. There must be people. There must be something behind this. But if you dig and delve into it, the correspondence that you can find about it is that, well, there aren't many communities about. So it was an inspirational thing. I mean, I wouldn't do Salina's contribution down, but they were bigging it up. They were going, look, isn't this idea fantastic? Shouldn't we all be doing it, getting together? And they produced a manifesto in 1970, which I will read an extract from, which is in the book. The key mover was a guy called Tony Kelly, and he in fact penned this manifesto. And it consisted of initially a libertarian critique of what he called the supermarket society, followed by a call to arms for people to join communal groups, with descriptions of the various forms of intentional community that readers are urged to aspire to, including urban craft-based communes, rural back-to-the-land groups, island communities offshore, self-built country communities, and big house farming groups. And the stated aims of the movement was, let us state our ethic as a federation. Everyone shall be free to do whatever he or she wishes, provided only that he or she does not transgress the freedom of another. The only morality is to experience and create contentment for all of us. And species notwithstanding, there was a whole vegan ethic. This is very early vegan ethic woven through certainly the early writings of the movement. And they supported free-range farming and the contentment of animals on the same basis as humans. And one thing that actually would come back to haunt them is that to prevent any possible growth of an internal power structure, we do not allow rejection or expulsion of any member of the movement for any reason whatsoever. Very libertarian, very anarchist libertarian background. I'm going to move the slides on. This is an early meeting of the communes movement. Far right is Tony Kelly. He died about 10 years ago. I have not managed to identify all these people. I know one or two of them. This was sort of this early communes movement, trying to get groups through. And a number of groups grew out of that, but it was tiny. It was. You could probably, get all the people in one photograph, in fact. We'll move on. Good. Then something very interesting happened. This is a self-published memoir under the name of Alan Beam. It wasn't his real name, and in fact a lot of the people, the names have been changed to hide their identity. The real name of the author is Nicholas Aubrey, who some of you may well have heard of. He went on later to set up the Institute for Social Invention and the Natural Death Centre much later. But he wrote this book, Rehearsal for the Year 2000. Move on, there's a better picture, just you might like to see. Piccadilly Circus, very early one morning. They decided this is what it would look like in the year 2000. That's Nick and his partner and baby with the goat. There are very few photographs of Nicholas Aubrey. The really interesting thing about Nick, he was working for an organisation called BIT Information Service in London. BIT Information Service was the hub of the counterculture in London. Move on. There you are. 24-hour help service, free information service. It ran crash pads, it did all sorts of things. It collected Green Shield stamps, for anybody who's that old, as a way of funding themselves. The reputation was you could phone them up and they would tell you how to fix your bike, fix your TV, find your way. If you were lost in the middle of London, you could phone up and they would give you a free crash pad. And Nicholas Aubrey sat there answering the phone. He was the hub. And he became secretary of this embryonic communes movement. And that suddenly expanded the movement hugely. What happened was the print run of the magazine increased tenfold. It became sold in sort of alternative shops, alternative bookshops, early vegetarian restaurants and things like that were actually taking the Communes magazine. And move on. They started to expand. And this is the sort of manifesto summed up in sort of mid-1970s marketing speak. The Communist movement exists to create a federal society of communities where everyone shall be, and you're then into the longer manifesto. This was issued. There was a Communes festival at the Roundhouse, which followed on from Nick taking this over. Over 200 people turned up, including John Peel was seen to be there, wandering around from the stalls. And that whole movement started to get a sort of real presence within the counterculture. Okay, a number of books were issued written by an Australian called Clem Gorman, living in London at the time. How to make a community, how to set a commune up, and it was later republished as People Together by a major mainstream publisher in the late 1970s. So it's essentially the same book with a sort of different editor. It included maps of the UK telling you where cheap land was available. It was seen as a practical manual to get people to go out and set up communes. And largely, I think these couple of books were people's inspiration. People got hold of them and went out. I actually have read them and wouldn't like to try and set up a community with the information that are in those books, but it was inspirational. Okay, Bill? There was also this thing in the period called the CLAP tax. CLAP stands for the Community Levy on Alternative Projects. There was an idea that the sort of counterculture could find out a way of funding itself, and that was to raise a levy on all the projects' profits. The unfortunate bit of this is there weren't many profits, but it did distribute in the period it was going over £30,000, which is not a small sum in the late 1970s. That was to fund other groups, and there's a list of sort of groups that had been funding it in that round of the CLAP tax. Okay, and then it was seen as that was a way to set up communal groups. This is a reference to a group called the Diggers in London at the time. This is sort of different overlapping bits of the countercultural network. The guy at the front with what I can't quite work out whether it's a didgeridoo or not is Sid Rawle, who became known as King of the Hippies. He was involved in this Diggers movement, and what the movement became in my mind was a series of overlapping different groups that knew of each other and occasionally met, but essentially were not a single movement. That the movement was a much more layered thing than actually looking back at the documentation would lead you to believe. And so there were things like the squatting movement that clearly had communal houses. There was Sid Rawle and his Hyde Park Diggers and the whole Diggers movement. There were actual sort of communes, sort of back to the land communes, and there were sort of urban communal houses as well. And so it was much more layered than I'd initially thought. Okay, Bill? In 1973, Nick Aubrey was responsible for a book of visions, which was essentially a directory of the Alternative Society. And it was actually part of a competition. You could win £1,500 to set up your vision. And this is the start of the idea that eventually became the Institute for Social Inventions, which Nick later set up. Okay. Slight digression here. There was a sort of extra parallel movement at one time called run by the Teachers, which were a group in Wales. This is sort of early 1980s. Essentially, this group, particular communal group in North Wales, based in Bangor, decided that basically communes were full of hippies who could never get their shit together. And they were going to get it together and show you how to do it, and set up what was called the Alternative Communities Movement. And they produced posters and basically said, look, this is fantastic, why aren't you out there? Why aren't you joining the community? And they were very proactive and upfront about it. They, in fact, suffered from one of Tim's great things is they went through some serious change around their founder members and basically lost a lot of credibility and sort of disappeared suddenly in the late 1980s. Okay, Bill? So the communist movement started off as this smoke and mirrors inspirational thing, then became this diverse layered thing. The communist movement itself, the people involved in it, morphed, I would say, in something called Communes Network. And this is the bit where the rule that said you could never expel a member came back to bite people, because essentially there were a number of members of the movement who people wanted to expel. So what they were eventually forced to do was disband the movement and set up something else called Communes Network. Communes Network ran from the late 1970s through into the 1990s. It was a much more fluid, supportive network, much less propaganda, promotion thing. It was a thing to support the communities that were set up during that period, and existed in my mind as much in the sort of interpersonal, informal interactions between people than it did in any sort of publication. There was a Communes Network newsletter, but it really existed in that sort of person-to-person, community sort of interactions. It organised a number of conferences at Lauriston Hall. There were gatherings. The gatherings fed into something called the International Communes Network, which was sort of European. We were a bit big in calling it international, but it was European-wide, which started off at the same sort of time as the ICSA. And there was a bit of niggle between the two. I was involved in the International Communes Network, and we saw this bunch of academics coming in and organising conferences and talking about it. What did they know about communal living? You find then you talk to them, they know quite a lot actually. And maybe you should talk to them. But at the start there was that bit of niggle, and they organised a conference that clashed with one of our festivals, and they were trying to muscle in. And interestingly, a lot of the debate around the International Communes network was, did we want to be a sort of loose network, and sort of enjoying each other's company and having a festival now and again, or did we want to be a hard-nosed sort of marketing, sort of going out there and getting people? And that was never resolved, and the international network sort of faded away eventually, and the ICSA is still here because, well, academics like getting together and enjoying each other's company. So what, I'm going to wind up now. What has happened to that sort of communes movement? Does it still exist? And I would say that layered movement that I was talking about, yes, the layered movement still exists in different ways. I think the communes network still exists. About the only thing we do together anymore in this country is get together once a year for a volleyball championship. There are various other things that happen around the volleyball championship, and it's not very greatly competitive. We have a prize for coming first and a prize for coming last. We have cooperative rules. But the interaction between that level of communities still goes on, interpersonal, intercommunity. Probably not as much as it did when communities were first setting up, but largely that's because those communities have become embedded more in their local geographic area and do not need the sort of solidarity support from someone at the other end of the country who's trying to do the same thing. There is still a squatting movement in this country. There is still an urban housing co-op movement that has numbers of communal houses. There is also a layer of spiritual communities that used to have a network of Christian communities. I would have thought they've probably still got the same internal networking. So I would still say that there is something called the communes movement in this country, but it's very hard to put the finger on it. Okay?